Mr. O'Brien here, and what we're going to start talking about first in topic 1 are themes of life. And with themes of life, the first thing with themes of life are what actually makes something a living thing. So what scientists have come up with are these characteristics. So every living thing shares these characteristics of life. If one of those characteristics are missing, then the organism is not considered a living thing. So some of the characteristics of life that we have are order. Just simply things have a repeating pattern, a repeating structure. They're made of cells. Those cells combine into tissues. Those tissues form organs, and then organ systems, and then eventually an organism. Living things have evolutionary adaptation. So in other words, they evolve, they change over time. They respond to the environment. Just like when you put your hand on a hot stove, your first instinct is to remove it. They reproduce in order to keep the population going. They grow, they develop, they change, okay? They go from a tiny baby into an adult. They need a source of energy, and also they need to regulate themselves with heat and things along those lines. Now, biology is literally the study of life. So when we talk about biology, we're studying living things. We're studying how life exists. So what exactly does define life? Now, most biologists look for a set of general characteristics that we refer to as the characteristics of life. And again, we talked about this in the first slide. And again, we have order, which is our first one, evolutionary adaptation. Respond to the environment. Organisms reproduce. They need an energy source. They grow and develop, and they need to regulate themselves. Now, some scientists add an additional one here. And that additional characteristics of life is that all organisms contain a genetic code called DNA. So almost all organisms use DNA as their genetic code to pass on genetic information. Sometimes this eighth one, it kind of goes hand in hand with reproduction. But I like to kind of talk about it as a separate characteristic of life because all organisms use DNA, and they use that DNA to reproduce and pass on their genetic traits. Now, an organism must exhibit all 8 of these characteristics of life, or 7 depending on which one you look at, in order to be classified as living. And we're going to talk about something that portrays almost all of these and is not considered a living thing. So let's go through the different characteristics of life. Now, the first one we have here are living things display order. Now, when we're talking about order, we're talking about highly organized structures in their cells, tissues, organs, or organ systems. Now, the easiest way to think of that is simply all organisms are made of cells. Now, this right here is a plant cell. And if we look at one of these plant cells, we see this rigid structure called the cell wall on the outside. And you'll notice that that same structure is repeated over and over again until eventually we make a tree. So, in other words, this organism has microscopic cells. Those microscopic cells can combine together to form a 100-foot redwood tree. Now, another example we have is this millipede over here. Now, you notice that this millipede contains body segments right here. See how there's those little tiny segments? Now, each single one of those body segments contains 2 legs per segment. So again, that's a repeating pattern. That's an organism showing order. They have repeating characteristics. Again, living things display order. Now, another example we have are the internal structures of these hair-like structures called cilia. Now, cilia are actually found inside of our esophagus, and they help move mucus and allows our body to kind of maintain its internal conditions. Now, a paramecium is a microscopic organism that is able to move and feed on things actively. Now, if you'll notice the cilia of a paramecium and the cilia of a trachea inside us, if we take a cross section of that, we'll notice that they look almost identical. And really, they are identical because organisms show order. Now, another way that we can show order is just kind of how things progress. So again, this is the smallest, and as we progress to the largest order, now we can go even a little larger when we go into ecology, but for the most part, all organisms are made of cells. When those cells combine, they combine to a specialized tissue, like muscle tissue or skin tissue. That tissue combines to form an organ, like our hearts. That organ is then combined with other parts of the body to form an organ system, like our, the heart, the veins, the pumping of the blood, the lungs to get oxygen through the muscles. And when we combine all of those organ systems together, we create the horse, which is our organism there. Again, smallest to largest there. Now, the second characteristics of life we have is that organisms evolve over time. Now, when we talk about evolution or evolving, what we're talking about is organisms changing very slightly in order to create an adaptation or a competitive edge in the environment. Now, in a population, individuals with favorable traits will survive and reproduce at a higher rate. So, for example, in, let's just say, a population of deer, if antler size makes them reproduce more, that means that organisms are going to continue to get larger and larger antler sizes because it gives them a competitive edge. So we call this favorable trait an evolutionary adaptation. So again, an adaptation is some sort of thing that gives it's a competitive advantage. Now, a couple examples I have here are this beetle right here. Now notice these beetles have these very large pincers right here, and these pincers actually aren't able to bite things, but instead they're used almost like a beacon to the female beetle as a mating thing. So the larger their pincers, the better chance they have of reproducing because it shows strength. Now another one we have, and one that's not too popular, is a bee. Now bees have evolved to have a stinger. Now that stinger allows it to protect not only itself, but also its hive. Now, the thing about the stinger is once a bee actually stings an individual, it dies. So this adaptation is all about protecting the hive, not necessarily itself. Again, evolve over time, they change to have competitive adaptations in order to reproduce more successfully. Now, let's talk about a couple different animals and their adaptations. So the first one we have is a camel right here. Now notice, why does the camel have these humps? And the reason for this is water storage. So camels live in the desert. So in order for them to survive for long extended periods of time and walk for long extended periods of time, they need this water storage mechanism for their survival. Now, camels can drink gallons upon gallons of water in one sitting, and those humps help store that water. The pufferfish right here, these spikes don't always, in other words, the pufferfish doesn't look like this all the time. A pufferfish will actually suck in water and make itself look spiky in order to scare animals away. So this is almost a protection mechanism to allow it to survive, giving it just enough time to get away. Now, the giraffe here, notice how it has a very long neck. Now, this long neck allows it to get its energy source, and that energy are the leaves at the tops of the trees. Now, again, long neck, reach higher leaves, is able to survive better. And then finally, some of them are just camouflage, and you notice this is what's known as a leaf gecko right here. Now this allows it to blend in with other leaves, which means it won't get eaten, which means it will survive and pass on its traits. So again, all of these adaptations allow it to survive better. Now the next one we have are living things respond to the environment. Now the way we say this is respond to stimuli. Now you'll notice this little video that's playing down at the bottom over and over again. the Venus flytrap responds to its environment of the fly landing on to try and steal some of its sweet nectar. And what happens is when there's these little tiny hairs, when they get stimulated, it allows the plant to close on the fly. And when it closes, it then uses that as obviously a food source. So living things have the ability to respond to the environment. Now you respond to environment when you're cold, you put on a jacket. When you're hot, you take off the jacket. Or when you put your hand on a hot stove, your first instinct is to release it off the stove because it's a safety precaution your body has evolved to have over time. So being able to adjust to the surroundings of the environment is very important for survival. An insect flying away immediately after sensing a vibration is an example of this. In this case, this fly, it gets eaten instead. Now, the next one we have is a very important one, and that is homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain a specific range of internal conditions. So, for example, when you are cold, you start to shiver. That's your body creating internal friction to heat yourself up. Shivering is actually a mechanism to warm up your body. Now, another one is like when you're very, very hot, you're working out at football workouts or basketball workouts and you begin to sweat. What sweat does is it evaporates off your body and it cools your body. So these are mechanisms to maintain homeostasis or maintain internal conditions. Now, this chicken right here, it also maintains homeostasis, but it's not able to sweat or shiver. So just like a dog, chickens actually pant in order to regulate their internal temperatures. Now again, both of these organisms right here are golden retriever, Michael Jordan. Sorry about that. They both maintain homeostasis in their body by regulating temperature. Again, the dog does it by panting, and Michael Jordan does it by sweating. Again, both lowering their body temperature, but they're doing it in different ways. Again, homeostasis, maintaining internal conditions. So the next one we have are living things need to reproduce. Now, reproduction is not something that allows an organism to survive, but what it does instead is it allows the organism to survive over generations and generations into the future. So all life has the ability to reproduce because it's in other words, making more of that species. So reproduction is just simply passing on their genes to create a healthy, fertile offspring. So the example we have here is this frog. So this frog lays millions of eggs inside of the pond in hopes that maybe 5 of them survive. So again, reproduction, passing on your genes, which again is made of DNA inside of our cells. And again, DNA, we're going to talk about that a little later. So again, reproduce. Living things need the ability to reproduce. So we have 2 types of reproduction. We have asexual and sexual reproduction. And both of these things have their own little benefits that they have. So asexual reproduction is a type of reproduction by which offspring arise from a single organism and they inherit the same genes of the parent. So in other words, they're producing clones or exact copies. This is the type of reproduction that is very well suited to produce a large amount of numbers very quickly, like your diseases, okay? Like when you get strep throat or things like that. The bacteria inside your body are just replicating so that it can kind of take over the available spots in your body. Again, very simple, very quick, but not a lot of genetic diversity. Sexual reproduction is much longer. It takes a much longer time in order to produce a fertile offspring. But what you're doing is you're producing a genetically different individual. You're producing something from 2 different genetic gene pools to create a brand new structure. It creates diversity And what it does is it prevents a single disease from just wiping out an entire species. So moving along here, living things also have the ability to grow and develop. So the example I have here is starting with an egg of the frog, right? Day 1, it looks like an egg. By day 85, it converts itself into a frog, being able to live on both land and in water. So again, they grow, they develop, they change. So grow and develop, organisms grow and develop along a specific sequence based on the DNA inside of your body. So an example is a grasshopper as well. So this would be develop right here, because they're changing form, and this is actually just grow, because when a grasshopper hatches, it looks like a mini grasshopper, and eventually it grows into a bigger grasshopper. So organisms, they don't necessarily do both of these things, but one or the other is kind of how they're going to go. They're going to grow and they're going to develop over time. Now, living things also need to obtain a source of energy. So each organism must have a source of energy or a way to fuel life functions. In other words, organisms need to eat. Now, not all organisms actually have to eat, because there's these things called autotrophs. So the autotroph in this picture is actually the plant. So the plant is able to make their own food, and they do that using the sunlight. So they capture the sunlight, and what they do is they convert that into organic molecules. Now, the caterpillar has to eat its food, and we call that a heterotroph. So heterotrophs need to eat things in order to harness their energy in their body. So again, they both harness their energy differently, but both organisms need to get energy from some source. Now, again, the example I have here, monarch caterpillar eating the leaf. Again, the leaf also has to harness this energy using photosynthesis. The last one we have are living things use the universal genetic code called DNA. Now, DNA is a double helix structure, and you can kind of see that over here. Double helix just simply means that it's double-stranded, and it kind of looks like a spiral staircase. In other words, it twists and turns as it moves up. So again, kind of like if I kind of draw it here, you notice how there's different rungs and how they turn and twist going up. Again, not a great picture, but you kind of understand what I'm saying. Now, why DNA is important is that information found in DNA is copied and passed from parent to offspring and is almost identical in every single organism. So every single organism on Earth is based on 4 different nucleotides. So all the genetic diversity we have on Earth is pretty much based on 4 molecules that are combined in different ways to give us different structures. So again, why we talk about this and why it's important is the characteristics of life tell biologists if something is living or non-living. If one characteristic is missing, the specimen is not considered living. So you're probably asking, well, why is it important to learn these characteristics in life? Because biology literally means the study of life. So we need to know what classifies an organism as life. So the one example and the best example they always say of whether something is living or non-living is a virus. So a virus, pretty much what it does is it replicates and it hijacks a cell in order to reproduce. It needs a host cell. So without a cell, viruses cannot replicate. So a virus shows almost all of the characteristics of life, but it can't replicate on its own, and it also doesn't need to consume energy in order to survive. So because these 2 or 3 things, even though, let's just say 5 of them meet the characteristics of life, because 1 or 2 or 3 of them don't, a virus is considered a non-living organism. So Because it doesn't fulfill all of the characteristics of life, it is not considered a living thing. So again, here are 8 characteristics of life. Again, remember, all of them need to be met in order to be considered a living thing. Hopefully this video gets you off on the right track. Again, this is Mr. O'Brien. Hopefully this helps you out and gets you ready for our next section coming up in our themes of life.